In the 1970s, a commercial for chicken was presented on national television. It wasn't the finger-licking, honey-dipped fast food kind, though. No, the chicken company I am referring to boasted in their commercial that children all over the world wanted their mothers to cook and serve them this chicken. So, children representing various nationalities were cast in this commercial, and dressed in their native garb, each child shouted his and her praises of this chicken in their native language one by one. The last child shown, however, wore American clothes and shouted his approval in slang English. The slang phrase used by the child was, "What's happening, Holly Farms?" Holly Farms was the name of the chicken company. Now, some may have considered this to be cute or were grateful that this particular child was included, but it does not require rocket science to understand the message. The message conveyed was that this child had no mother country. The commercial presented this last child as being an American invention, possessing no history in either native language or culture prior to being on American shores. The last child shown was African American. This commercial very vividly expresses the stereotypical role in which people of African descent are always cast in relation to history. The distorted picture is that Africans and people of African descent have no connection to history when it comes to food and cooking, or for that matter, on any other front that is worth knowing, much less celebrating. Television has been merely one of a number of medias successful in promoting, consciously and unconsciously on the part of programmers and sponsors, such stereotypes. Books are another. Cookbooks were, and too many still are, one of the bastions of racism in this country, as many of them as well are guilty of twisted and perverted lies which deny the importance and validity of the culinary and cultural history and contribution of Africa and African America. Now, as an African American from Chicago, I was appalled and insulted by the cookbooks I read back in the 1970s and 80s, which in essence said that Africa had not contributed anything to world cuisine. For example, one volume states that Africa had not come into contact with most fruits and vegetables, tobacco, tea, or coffee until the invasion by the Portuguese, and that Europeans were responsible for revolutionizing food and cooking on the African continent. The discourse in other volumes on African cooking usually offered the same themes. One, no food products were indigenous to Africa, thereby precluding Africans from being able to develop any cuisine prior to European invasion. And two, Africans came into contact with 99% of the foods they consumed only as the result of the slave trade. And three, African culinary traditions vary from country to country and have absolutely nothing in common. It was clear that the history of African cuisine had been colonized. When I first came across these books, my intentions at the time were very simply to bring new recipes into my kitchen representative of my roots. I began to read cookbooks on other peoples of color throughout the world. What I found was numerous commonalities in ingredients and cooking styles and methods between Africa and the rest of the world. The search for different recipes turned into research, one discovery leading to another and yet another, each new discovery more exciting than the last. But reweaving the African American culinary tapestry was not an easy task. The journey took 15 years as I consulted more than 4,000 sources, some the result of travel to various locales and repositories, such as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the Newberry Library in Chicago, Harvard University's Harvard Yen Ching Library, and Yale University's Divinity School Library. The one thing I realized was that I had to try to challenge all of the lies and misinformation that have prevailed, or better yet, decolonize African and African American cooking. The result is the Peppers, Cracklings, and Knots of Wool Cookbook, The Global Migration of African Cuisine, a 422-page treatise containing about 170 recipes, most of them my own original creations. And I want to briefly share with you an overview of what is in the book. First, I would like to say something about the title of my book. The title showcases merely three of the many ties that culinarily and culturally bind people of color throughout the world. Peppers are certainly a common staple of various cultures the world over, from Mexico, Central and South America, Africa, to India, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, China, and Japan. Cracklings. Well, cracklings are a culinary item we usually associate with Black folks cooking in the southern part of the United States. Mexicans and South Americans also eat cracklings, which they call chicharrones. In addition, I also found a reference to ancient Egyptian consumption of cracklings and how they were kept in jars on shelves by shopkeepers. Now, knots of wool refers to African hair. A most common hairstyle worn by ancient women of color was the hair combed up high on the head and twisted or rolled into a ball or knot, a top knot. This hairstyle was common to the women of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, and in some areas of the Americas as well. If you are familiar with the deity Buddha, you will notice that the hair is in a top knot. The earliest pictures of depicting Buddha will show his hair and facial features to be much more African. Also, while doing research on my chapter on the Olmecs, I came across a Mexican song of food and love. The lyrics asks to find a girl with her hair done up in a knot of wool. You will find the song in its entirety in chapter 3. Now, as for the book itself, the first chapter, Feasting Among the Eastern Ethiopians, the African Element in Dravidian Cuisine, looks at the primacy of Africa as the home of humankind and Africa's primacy in the area of iron smelting and the mining of metals, and how such mining activity impacted upon agriculture and cooking, allowing the development of an array of cooking styles. The first recipe in my book is called Olodowan Egusi Stew, and it bears that name because I wanted to pay homage to the earliest human Stone Age technology, and that first Stone Age culture belongs to the Olodowan or Oldowan and dates at about 2.4 million years old. The stew is prepared with toasted and ground seeds from the egusi melon, very popular in West African cuisine, and they are incorporated among the stew's 21 ingredients with crushed and whole tomatoes, together with a spice blend of freshly toasted and ground cumin, coriander, yellow and black fenugreek seeds, whole allspice and cloves, and cinnamon stick. The spices are first sauteed alone, then together with onions and chilies, just prior to melding its flavors with molasses, chopped collard greens, and beef chunks in a simmering broth for an hour and a half to 2 hours. Rice is served with this stew and is an ingredient in a number of the recipes in this chapter. It is a favorite staple, as is coconut, and is common to Africans, Indians, and Asians, and prepared in abundance. I would just like to say a few words about rice, and it is important because it speaks again to those little cookbooks that I mentioned earlier. Most of the world sees rice as an Asian agricultural product, but there's also African rice, Oryza glamarima, A different species was domesticated in West Africa at least 3,000 years ago, and we will probably eventually find out that it was much earlier. African rice is nutritionally superior to Asian rice and was domesticated in West Africa many centuries before its Asian cousin was introduced into the continent. Before the Cambridge World History of Food was published in, I believe, 2000, it was generally accepted that Asian rice was older. However, the Cambridge study offers the parallel development theory of African and Asian rices. African rice is believed to have origins in the central Niger Delta, a region now being researched as a major agricultural gene center. Prehistoric Africans carried it to various parts of the continent, where expert African farmers further developed its production. West Africa's Mandingo and Sissu peoples combine rice flour and honey to make a sweet tasting bread used only as a centerpiece for ceremonial rituals. Rice beer is very popular throughout West Africa, and in Nigeria, a special beer known as betso or busa is made from rice and honey. But now the other staple I mentioned is coconut, an extremely versatile and important ingredient in the cuisines of tropical peoples the world over. I have included a recipe called coconut rice, flavored with chilies, ginger root, onions, and freshly toasted and ground spices, first browned a bit in sesame seed oil. The entire mixture is then gently simmered with finely grated coconut in a creamy coconut milk. Coconut oil, milk, and or grated coconut meat are always found in gravies and spice blends and intricate dishes prepared by Africans, Indians, Indonesians, and Southeast Asians. Africa's intercontinental trade in spices, ivory, iron, and other precious goods with India and Far East is another important focal point of the chapter, as it points to African and Indian culinary and cultural similarities, and how those same culinary and cultural characteristics migrated right into Southeast Asia. Catfish harvest and celebration among the sons and daughters of Kambu heads chapter 2 and presents the legacy of the presence of the Black race in Southeast Asia, China, and Japan from the most remote period in Asian history. Various Black groups in Asia have been recorded, such as the Negritos and Ainus of Japan, which accounts for a Japanese proverb which states, "For a samurai to be brave, he must have a bit of Black blood." In addition, the Khmers of Southeast Asia, a people generally described as having tight curly hair and as being Black, was one of numerous ancient Eastern civilizations that still bear many African imprints. Such imprints were part of the dominant cuisine and culture of Southeast Asia for almost 7 centuries. The ancient Khmers of Southeast Asia had much in common with Africans, as both male and female Khmers wore their hair in corn-rowed braids and top knots, and they were very fond of black-eyed peas. But no matter what was on the menu, they too loaded their dishes with hot peppers and spices. And with that in mind, African merchants and explorers did not relegate their movements to the eastern part of the world. In chapter 3, titled Peppers, Cracklings, and Knots of Wool, African Foods and Culinary Heritage in Mexico and Central America, the culinary practices of the mother culture of Mesoamerica, better known as the Olmecs, are the focal point. Africa's East and West Coast cultures made their indelible marks through exploration, migration, and trade expeditions on the Olmecs and Mayans, the Chavin, mound builders, Caribs, and other cultures in the Americas long before Columbus's voyages. That is why in Peppers, I had to compare the so-called discovery of America to the so-called discovery of the G zone or G spot. I'm certain that you are all familiar with the G spot. In 1950, a German physician by the name of Ernest Grafenberg claims to have discovered a zone or spot in the woman's vagina, which, when properly manipulated, would produce orgasm. That zone was named after Dr. Grafenberg, and books have been written about the so-called G spot. So why did I make such a comparison? Because like the G zone, America had been there all the time, and many people, including Africans and Asians, were well aware of its existence. 20 and 30-ton basalt heads revealing African features, one with cornrows, were excavated in Mexico in the 19th and 20th centuries. And when you look at Mexico's and South America's religious practices, games of ball, surgical procedures, calendar, and practice of mummification, you find that they were the same as practiced in Africa. So I do not think it should come as a surprise that many words for crops grown in the Americas have been traced to African sources. Which brings me to the cacao bean, or what is better known as the source of chocolate, an agricultural product used as money in the ancient Americas. In my book, I introduce my chocolate cake recipe, which is in a later chapter, by talking about the negative names and connotations always given to chocolate cake, such as devil's food, sin cake, death by chocolate, chocolate beast, chocolate death, chocolate decadence, while the term angel food is usually given to a white or pale colored cake. But you see, this walks hand in hand with the negative images and meanings and connotations always associated with phrases that use the term black or dark, such as, this is just a black day for all of us, or he's in a dark mood. Mhm. That is why I call my cake Black Beauty Chocolate Coconut Cake, because it is, by physical definition, exactly what the name says. If I define its taste, I could surely call it angel food. This cake is truly marvelous with its fresh, finely ground coconut embedded into the deep, rich chocolate cake. The blend of three different extracts adds to the exciting flavor. I would just like to add that the cacao is in the same botanical family as the kola nut, a plant indigenous to Africa. The word cacao itself has been traced back to Olmec culture. Well, the ancient Chavín of Peru were a sister culture of the Olmecs of Mexico. In chapter 4, titled Zancu, Sweet Potatoes, and Beer, African merchants and Peruvian kitchens from the coast to the highlands, I discuss an age-old method of agriculture practiced by both Peruvian and African societies, terrace field cultivation. Culinary and cultural traditions of Peruvian society point to direct contact with African elements of Mexico, Central America, and Africa itself. Peruvian and African societies share linguistic similarities, as well as sharing culinary use of a number of the same foods, such as peanuts and the golden berry, and similar cooking methods, such as escabeche. They also shared culinary use of cassava. Try my garden patties with onion and cassava cream gravy, which is presented in this chapter. Vegetarians should enjoy this one. The patties are filled with calabash squash, great northern beans, carrots, fresh raisins, nuts, chilies, spices, and other ingredients, which are first pureed, then spooned into a hot buttered skillet, and then browned on both sides. The patties are served doused with the creamy gravy. The dried and ground form of cassava is used in this recipe and is also known as gari in Africa and Brazil. People in the Congo favored malt liquors made with cassava. Long ago, the Caribs of St. Vincent used special equipment to extract poisonous juice from bitter cassava, also called bitter manioc or yucca, to process it for consumption. Bitter manioc contains prussic acid in its juices. Cooking can remove it, but the root contains so great a quantity that it is eaten raw or improperly cooked, it could kill you. The other variety, sweet manioc, tastes very similar to the white potato. In Body and Soul, the miscegenation of cuisine and culture in Brazil and Cuba, which is chapter 5, the retention of African culture in religion and folkways, and the complete Africanization of Brazilian and Cuban cuisine is explored. I think that the cuisines of Brazil serve as one prime example of the many African agricultural products transferred to the Americas, which makes the statements from that cookbook that I mentioned earlier concerning Europeans introducing Africans to tea and coffee and other foods particularly frustrating and particularly racist when you consider that the facts are just the opposite. There is, as of now, a 3 volume study, The Lost Crops of Africa, published by the National Academy of Science in Washington, D.C., that provides long lists of cultivated and wild fruits, vegetables, legumes, roots, and tubers that are a mere part of the wealth of foods that are Africa's own indigenous agricultural heritage. One or two foods indigenous to Africa and listed in volume 1 include custard apples, grapes, fluted pumpkin, tamarind, and bambara groundnuts, which are peanuts. Peanuts were and still are an important staple in South American, African, and Asian kitchens. My book includes a number of recipes that call for chopped peanuts or walnuts. In one such recipe, spicy fish with peanut sauce, the boneless fish is browned in a spiced rice flour and peanut coating. It is then served on a bed of sauce that has been gently simmered to blend the flavors of oyster and fish sauce, caramel sugar, spices, peanuts, tomatoes, chilies, ginger root, coconut milk, and other ingredients. The peanut, it seems, is another food that has had its origins contested for years. Books with outlines of agricultural gene centers lists South America as the origin of peanut. But it is very noticeable that the places designated as being areas of origin are the same exact areas where there was strong, influential African presence in remote times. Whenever the question arises regarding its possible origin in Africa, you are immediately guided to its use by slave traders as food for Africans on board slave ships bound for the Americas. And this, most books tell you, is how Africans first came in contact with it. But take a look at the 3 volume treatise titled Africa and the Discovery of America by Leo Weiner. Weiner philologically shows that the original term for the peanut is derived from Arabic, but that all other forms are derived from the Mandingo. Well, it makes sense, seeing that Bambara groundnuts, which are peanuts, are indigenous to Africa. As early as the 1300s, the Mandingo peoples of Mali were observed grinding peanuts and adding them to their bread doughs and cakes. The oil from peanuts was used in culinary preparations, as well as furnishing light for lamps, and as oil to lubricate the skin. Mixed with a particular type of clay and earth, it helped to make plaster for their houses. Another agricultural product indigenous to Africa that many of us find ourselves in the habit of consuming is coffee. That's right, no Juan Valdez and no mule. Coffee was right alongside of African religion, folkways, traditions, and innovations in music, dance, and most certainly cuisine as they were transplanted from the mid and late 1500s to 1888 in Brazil and 1868 in Cuba. And one of the most important catalysts for this transplantation was the African female cook. The African female, as slave, dominated the Brazilian and Cuban plantation kitchens, becoming masters of gastronomic activity in both colonies and enriching them with a variety of new flavors. These new flavors helped to bring about the complete Africanization of Brazilian and Cuban cuisine. Coffee, as one of these new flavors, came to play an enormous role in Brazilian and Cuban, as well as Portuguese and Spanish economic expansion. It also helped to expand Brazil's and Cuba's culinary repertoire. Desserts and various mixed drinks were made much more exciting with the addition of coffee. And I'd like to make some suggestions from my book. Try my Sao Paulo Midnight Express or Havana Good Morning Kiss or my Innocent Bahian Passion, which before served must be strained through the lower portion of a nightgown in which a woman has slept for 2 consecutive nights. See, now you will have to experience for yourself coffee's role in love potions and so-called sexual magic. Read the book. You might also find a few other items of interest in this same chapter, Body and Soul. I tell you, it seemed as though Portuguese nuns during this early time period were rather preoccupied with trying to work a little sexual magic themselves in the foods they prepared in the convents. And it was while I was engaged in research in this area that I attended a contemporary art exhibit with a theme depicting female anatomical parts, which inspired the name of one of my recipes in this chapter. When I read the artist's description of the theme, it immediately made me think of the Portuguese nuns. So you may want to try my recipe for incendiary vaginas. Coconut milk and sugar are first combined and simmered, then their temperatures raised for 30 minutes in the oven. Each morsel is filled with crushed cloves, grated coconut, chopped dates, and spiked with red wine. Chapter 6, Without Rival Anywhere, the cultural impact of the African cook in the Americas, looks at culinary traditions of Africans in slavery in the Caribbean colonies, colonial America, and in the antebellum Southern kitchen, where African cooks were never known to measure. Earlier, I mentioned my chocolate cake recipe, which is offered in this chapter. Southern Black cooks' cake baking certainly helped the plantation's reputation of hospitality rest on its dining room table. That reputation forged the African cook as status symbol, one that provided slave-holding society with an image of class, a high station, and respectability. The exploitation of Africans in cookbook publishing in the 18th and 19th centuries and the concept of Southern cooking, which I state started out as whites only cuisine, is only one of many issues of concern in Chapter 7, Economics, War, and the Northern Migration of the Southern Black Cook. New Orleans' reputation as a city of great food by way of African cooks, and a seldom written page in African culinary history, the steamboat era, are also covered. I found a number of sources that testified that the meals prepared by the Black cooks on board the steamboats were so good that diners fought over the food. Now, whatever you do, check out those influential Africans in this chapter who controlled the city of Philadelphia through its stomach. the Guild of the Philadelphia Caterers. My last chapter should interest all who enjoy jazz, blues, and rhythm and blues music. Flapjacks and Blue Notes examines the connection between African American music and African American cuisine and how cultural imperialism has constantly pushed African Americans into a small, unlit, insignificant culinary corner, a corner that has kept African Americans dangling on the periphery of their own cultural art forms. African Americans have been defined out of their own culinary creations, just as they have been defined out of their own music since arriving on now American. In addition, this chapter explores African Americans as culinary role models and their exploitation in advertising, exploitation that has catapulted such brand names as Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben and Cream of Wheat into some of capitalism's most successful ventures. These and other companies have all, from the mid to late 19th century on, used Black, smiling faces to skyrocket sales of their products. Now, I would like to end with one last remark, and it is related to the eradication of smallpox. Now, I know what you think. What possible connection does smallpox have with cuisine, African American or anyone else's? Let me start by stating that traditional African methods of herbal cures were transplanted and continue to be used by herbal specialists in African communities here in America. Black women, such as Doctress Phyllis of Barrington, Rhode Island, were recognized locally for their ability and expertise in African traditional medicine. One African traditional medicinal art was tremendously important to New England. In the year 1713, Boston, Massachusetts saw its fifth epidemic of smallpox. A white man by the name of Reverend Cotton Mather, famous for his role in the Salem witch trials, heard that Africans were boasting immunity to the disease. He decided to seek advice from his African slave, Onesimus. When Mather asked Onesimus, who was from the Akan Society in Africa, whether he had ever had the disease, Onesimus answered both yes and no. He told Mather that he had undergone a procedure that both gave him the smallpox and at the same time would always protect him from it. In describing the operation and the scar which was left from the procedure, Onesimus stated that it was easy and effective. Quote, people take the juice of the smallpox and cut the skin and put in a drop. Then by and by, a little sick, the few get smallpox and nobody die of it. Nobody have smallpox anymore. Unquote. Well, Boston's medical finest didn't buy it. Meanwhile, the epidemic was worsening. One doctor, however, decided to try the African method on his son and two slaves. As 11,000 persons were stricken, Cotton Mather and the doctor had inoculated 280 Bostonians. Out of this number, only 6 died, less than 1 in 50. Now here's the punchline. The story ends by telling us that it was, quote, Mather's meddling that led the way to a smallpox vaccine and prompted all-out immunizations in America, unquote. Following the effort, by May of 1980, the World Health Organization announced that the disease had been eradicated. Mather's meddling, huh? This is the same Cotton Mather who believed in witchcraft and was all in favor of executing women and girls for their supposed possession. Now, you know as well as I do that anybody that backwards doesn't know anything about science and medicine, even though he tried to dabble in it. I first read about Onesimus in a medical journal several decades ago. William D. Pearson's book, Black Yankees, published in 1988, mentions the story, and it was also presented in 2001 in a program on educational television, a lead in to a focus on Jonas Salk and the polio vaccine. However, while Onesimus was briefly, actually peripherally mentioned, nowhere in this medical journal article, nor in the educational television piece, was there mention of African medical ability or expertise. At no time were the Africans applauded, thanked, nor praised in any way for possessing the skills that saved the population of Boston. No, no. Down through the centuries, and even now in modern times, when this story is mentioned, thanks are awarded to Cotton Mather and Mather's medley. Ladies and gentlemen, we are met with the same colonization of history, the same historical omission when it comes to the ability and culinary legacies and traditions of the African cook in America. Let me repeat, African Americans have been defined out of, they have been denied their own culinary and cultural expertise since arriving on these shores. You see, the theft of Black culture was and still is an American tradition, a tradition that has been passed down just like recipes. Now, the many unpublished names of culinary artists and their creations must be rescued from oblivion. It is imperative to write more volumes that nail the coffin shut on the lies and distortions that have omitted these geniuses from history on the culinary front. When I wrote the Peppers, Cracklings, and Knots of Wool cookbook, The Global Migration of African Cuisine, I wanted it to stand as one of many more books to come that serve to restore that stolen legacy. Thank you.